The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, an author explores the final hours of Martin Luther King Jr. and what more we can do to fulfill his vision. Plus, a people's budget for economic justice. And on the Bill Press Show, how to guarantee health care for all Americans. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Every year, the Congressional Progressive Caucus puts forth the People's Budget. It's a roadmap to meeting the economic needs of all Americans. Our next guest explains why they do it and what's in it. And we say hello to Christopher D. Cook, an award-winning investigative journalist whose writing appears in The Atlantic, Mother Jones, The Economist, and many other publications. He's also the author of Diet for a Dead Planet, Big Business and the Coming Food Crisis. Christopher Cook, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, and our pleasure to have you with us. You've written quite a bit about an initiative our listeners may know little about. It's called the People's Budget. Tell us what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is actually something that the largest caucus, Democratic caucus in the House puts together. It's called the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And every year they put together the People's Budget as an alternative to both the Republican budget proposals, but also the mainstream Democratic Party budget proposals. And they tend to emphasize, there are variations year in and year out, but the points of emphasis are really on infrastructure, job creation, more of a tilt toward renewable energy, cutting at least a substantial portion of the massive waste in military spending, and really rebuilding a lot of the infrastructure across the United States and creating millions of jobs. So, and also there's a significant corporate tax accountability aspect to the People's Budget as well.
What are some of the highlights of the latest version?
Yeah, so there's so much in there. It's hard to reduce an entire budget, but they're talking about creating basically double the amount of the mainstream Democratic Party's budget for infrastructure and job creation. So basically like $2 trillion over 10 years for infrastructure. And they're saying that this would create 2.5 million jobs in the first year alone. And this is for everything from, addressing lead contamination in water systems to overhauling and expanding mass transit systems. A lot of emphasis on rebuilding school buildings, roads and bridges, things like that. And then, so there's a substantial difference there between the Democratic Party's, quote, better deal package definitely has infrastructure investments in it. But again, it's about half the amount that the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the People's Budget have put together. I think it's also noteworthy and really interesting that they talk about things like in federal procurement, so in federal contracts, emphasizing, women-owned businesses, people of color-owned businesses, and also even things like worker-owned cooperatives and employee-owned companies as getting priority in federal contracting. So there's sort of an economic justice component to this that you don't see that often or emphasize that much in most of the mainstream Democratic Party policies. I say mainstream Democratic Party, it's kind of an interesting distinction because, again, this is the largest Democratic caucus in the House, and yet the agenda, the broad strokes might sound similar to what we hear from the Better Deal and the mainstream party, but really, when you get down to the brass tacks, the kinds of dollar commitments that we're talking about, and the money on education and job creation and infrastructure, and even things like child care for universal child care, things like that, are really quite different from the budget that the Democratic Party leadership tends to put forth.
Is that because they don't realistically feel like they can get it through?
Well, I think that it's an interesting dynamic in Congress because, again, you've got the largest caucus putting forth this budget, and then each year the numbers of people supporting this budget keep going up, but it's still not enough to get it passed. So even on the Democratic side, like in 2017, they had 108 Democratic votes for it, but there were still 79 Democrats opposing the people's budget, and things like the minority leader and incoming House Speaker Nancy Pelosi abstaining rather than supporting the measure. And I can't read their minds to know why they don't support it and promote it more. I think this is one of those ongoing sort of discussions and battles within the Democratic Party about what the priorities ought to be. And so,
Sure.
It could be because there's greater emphasis on eliminating corporate tax loopholes. It could be because there's a greater emphasis on stimulus spending. It's hard to say, but I think it's also worth pointing out that there have been evaluations of the people's budget by groups like the Economic Policy Institute and also the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is a very centrist, bipartisan organization. And they have said, their analysis says that the people's budget would actually come out as a net positive in terms of revenue versus spending, and would actually decrease the federal debt much more so than even say the GOP budgets would.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the most significant ways in which the people's budget diverges from mainstream Democratic economic policies.
Yeah, I think that, again, the emphasis on corporate accountability is significant. The Democratic Party will sometimes give some lip service to this, but, in the end, they do everything from taking fossil fuel industry money. We've seen that change back by the Democratic National Committee to taking fossil fuel money again, to not substantially cutting corporate tax loopholes, for instance. And so this is something where the people's budget, really goes after that, in a way that's significantly more vigorous, I would say, and more substantial than the mainstream Democratic Party. And again, double the infrastructure investment, more of an emphasis on, a clearer emphasis on, again, creating jobs for people who are left out of the economy. So often people of color, white working class and poor people, really putting an emphasis on that kind of job creation is I think critical. And then, there's this interesting movement that's really gained steam or regained steam again in the new Congress around this idea of a Green New Deal. And it's not a new concept, really. It's been around for about a decade, but it's gotten new energy because of some of the new members of Congress, like Ocasio-Cortez from New York. And some of these elements are in the people's budget in terms of really pushing more aggressively toward renewable energy production, trying to emphasize, creating jobs, again, mass transit expansion, and moving toward more, electric mass transit, more sustainable mass transit. So that's a key area as well, and really like focusing more of the energy on, more of the funding really, and the funding priorities on creating renewable energy jobs, especially in areas where there's so much reliance right now on fossil fuel energy extraction. So there's an opportunity for, in the people's budget and in the Green New Deal, and there is some overlap. They are very different proposals, but to really target, some of the employment opportunities, specifically in areas where there's so much fossil fuel production going on, and there has to be this rapid transition to renewable energy and getting away from fossil fuels.
We're speaking with Christopher D. Cook, award-winning investigative journalist, author of Diet for a Dead Planet, Big Business and the Coming Food Crisis. Today we're talking about the people's budget. Christopher, is it your sense that there will be greater support for the people's budget in the 116th Congress? I mean, not only with new members, but perhaps with returning members?
I would think so. I mean, the trend has been, if you follow the vote totals, the trend has gone on, consistently in the direction of more support. And now you've got some more activists, populists, progressive populists, you might say, members of Congress coming in. I think that there's a lot to be sorted out. And, when we come into, when Congress comes in January, it's going to be really interesting to see. There are going to be so many competing agendas, not just areas of disagreement, but areas of, what's going to be prioritized. And in the end, the party leadership, the House caucus leadership from the House side, and then also the committee leadership really decides so much of what gets prioritized. Even if the leadership nods their heads at, some of these other ideas, the question is, will they get prioritized? And, I think it's clear, until 2020 at least, that what passes through the House is likely not to pass through the Senate, and certainly not to be signed by President Trump, for the most part, if not entirely. So a lot of this will be about laying the groundwork for 2020 and what the agenda is and what the conversation is going to be about. So I think what you'll probably see is at least an increased focus and emphasis on the people's budget and on maybe more support for it. I think that, in talking and interviewing with interviews I've done with some of the leaders in the people's budget movement, they don't expect the whole budget to pass, even if it gets more support. It's more about creating the conversation, but also certain planks of the people's budget might end up getting passed separately. So there are various ways that this could be sliced and diced. And then in terms of the Green New Deal, I think that, the energy is really significant, and the question will be, behind it is really significant. I think there are about 33 or 35, hard to keep count, supporters right now of creating a select committee on a Green New Deal to give it that focal point in the new Congress. And the question is, will Speaker Pelosi and other House leaders agree to that, or will they return to, they had a committee on global warming that she helped create in the past, but the committee had no legislative power, no ability to create legislation. So there'll be a lot of battles over this kind of stuff, and then there'll be overlap between, and I think that, what interests me and what I find important, why I'm focusing on these issues is because this is a really critical moment and opportunity for the Democrats and, to create jobs addressing climate crisis and also addressing economic struggle that so many Americans are actually still facing. I talk in my article about, we have, 4%, or now it's 3.9 or 3.8% unemployment. Sounds like a magical economy, everything's booming, but, we know that the unofficial unemployment rate is always roughly double because you've got so many millions of people who don't file for unemployment, who've given up temporarily, or who are part-time workers and can't qualify. So those numbers are always a low estimate. And then on top of that, you've got wage, stagnation, as they call it. So people's, wages have not kept up with the cost of living, to, put it bluntly. And, I have some figures that people can read about more in my story and in these times. But, they've just not kept up with the cost of living. And so you've got so many people around the country working multiple jobs and or economically struggling, even if they are employed, and barely keeping up.
Yeah. It's actually, I bet you those unemployment numbers are actually probably even a little higher, just because it has been a gig economy for so long now, it seems. You wrote an article recently for In These Times titled "The Democrats Need a Clear Economic Vision. Here's Where to Start." And in it, you mention another legislative initiative, which you touched on a little earlier, the Green New Deal. And there is crossover between these two measures, as you pointed out. Is there potential here for the whole to be greater than the sum of the parts?
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell. I mean, I think that I would like to say yes, but their political realities being what they are, when things start to get chewed up in Congress, they can end up with lots of different parts scattered all over the place instead of a greater sum. So I think it remains to be seen. I don't want to be too skeptical either, but I think what's interesting and exciting and hopeful is that these agendas are being put forth very assertively by new members of Congress. They're getting a lot of conversation, especially the Green New Deal. And I think that in January, when Congress comes into office, we'll see more conversation and focus on the people's budget agenda as well. And, so I think that, it really remains to be seen. I mean, you've got to see if the leadership will push and accept, the idea of a select committee on a Green New Deal, which again would give it a really clear, specific focus on creating a larger Green New Deal plan, as opposed to scattershot little bits and pieces of legislation in different committees. So there's a lot of turf issues to be worked out in terms of different committees and what their, quote, legislative jurisdiction is, as they put it. Hope I'm not losing anybody with those wonderful terms, but but this is the reality that we deal with, when you're talking about legislation in Congress. But there's also, I think that it's worth pointing out there's a substantial movement on the ground around the Green New Deal, and not just, there's been a new sort of surging movement of young folks, especially around climate, who have, and it's been really impressive to see, they turn out large numbers of people to protest at district offices of Congress members and at their DC offices. But there's also longer term, in these times where a really nice, interesting piece, another piece people can look up there by one of their editors, Sarah Lazare, and they, talk there about, there's been grassroots movements for green jobs and climate-friendly jobs for more than a decade or longer, really, in communities around the country, and to make sure that those jobs are not just about producing, giant, new exports in, American products that, it might sound good, but it's more production. It's like, the point is to marry this concept of renewable energy expansion and reducing energy consumption, eliminating fossil fuel use, and the focus on economic growth sometimes can be, again, even though that sounds like a nice concept, can be dangerous because it leads to more consumption and production that is not sustainable. And so I think that what a lot of people are pushing for and calling for is much more sustainable, perhaps slower growth, but much more sustainable. And, we've had, again, movements across the country that have been promoting this stuff for years. And now there's a really strong surging energy for this in the new Congress. So I think one way or another, you'll see something get put together in whatever the Democratic budget is. And, I guess my journalistic interest, as well as, my argument is that, why wouldn't the Democrats make this a focal point of their agenda to say, we're going to marry this concept of creating millions of jobs around the country with sustainable economic growth, economically and environmentally sustainable. And a lot of these jobs could be higher wage jobs, and basically eliminating, transitioning away from fossil fuel production, especially in some of those key states like West Virginia, Wyoming, Texas, Pennsylvania. There's other places around the country where there's so much, harmful carbon production that needs to stop. But we also can't just tell people to stop working. We need to create jobs for those folks, and transition and education and training, specifically training.
Well, the question in the article that you posed, why push a New Deal stimulus when America is sporting an unofficial unemployment rate hovering around 4%? We talked about it a little bit. This is some radical change. A lot of people, when the New Deal, the original New Deal with FDR came about, they didn't like that either. It got a lot of pushback initially too. We need to move to a different way that we do things in this country. It is going to be radical change in order to make that happen. Is that the scariest thing in front of people right now? The fact that, I'm not going to be digging in a coal mine. I'm going to be hanging solar panels instead?
I don't know what goes through individual people's minds around this. I mean, I think there's always fear of change. It's natural, both on the larger societal level and on individual levels. Everybody has like a certain amount of fear. I think that, the reality is that these, we're facing something that arguably is even more dire and existential than in the Great Depression, as horrific as that was. Because we're really facing, when we say existential, we mean it. The latest globally, agreed upon science shows that we have 10 to 12 years to radically reduce carbon emissions to avoid even more catastrophic and irreversible, climate crisis than we've already seen. Mm-hmm. And we're already seeing, everything from the massive, out of control wildfires that, climate may not have started the wildfire all the time, but it has a lot to do with how massive these fires are, as well as the same thing can be said of hurricanes. And actually climate has a lot to do with creating many of these hurricanes, but also the size of these hurricanes and the destructive power. And then you talk about farmers all across this country, in states, red states, blue states, you name it, who are getting absolutely devastated by this combination of chronic drought and also seasonal disruption, which is a fundamental element of climate change. And so crops get ruined or shriveled up, or never grow to the size that they're supposed to be, or, there's so many different things that happen to farmers all around this country that are directly related to climate. And I think people also should realize, that we're spending upwards of $300 billion with a B dollars a year on climate disasters right now. So when people worry about the cost of this stuff, well, it's going to create jobs which have multiplier effects in terms of benefiting local economies, individuals and local economies, and boosting people's wages. And it's preventive. We're already spending the money. It's already happening right now. We're spending the money on these climate-related disasters right now. And people need to really get their heads around, and the Democratic Party, frankly, really needs to get their heads around, that the climate crisis is here now, and that it's already devastating people around the country and around the globe. And unfortunately, the leadership of the parties, of the Democratic Party, will give some lip service to this. And Nancy Pelosi did create a global warming committee back in 2007, which is great, but again, now we're at a time where, 10 to 12 years to create this kind of carbon emissions reduction and renewable energy expansion. Think about how long it takes to get something through Congress and to get the budget to do these things, and then to actually spend the money in these communities. And that some of that money is about training. Some of that money is about transitioning to different job creation. Sometimes new facilities have to be built or refurbished in order to switch from manufacturing one thing to manufacturing something that's part of solar panels or windmills, things like that. So this work has to happen immediately. Massive forest expansion. And I'll just add, that an area that doesn't get much conversation really, that's fundamental, is our food system. I write a lot about this in my book, Diet for a Dead Planet, and in other articles. The food system is the largest sector contributing to climate change, the single biggest sector that is behind climate change. We need a fundamental transformation in our food system to address climate change, and a Green New Deal could really help address that through helping farmers, move toward organic farming, replenish soil, rebuild grasslands, forestry expansion, moving away from pesticides. There's so many different things that have to happen very quickly within our food system as well, and that can happen. And all the science is there to show that this can be done. The issue is about spending the money to make it happen. And
right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the important part too, is it's not like any of this is not attainable. It's all attainable. It's a matter of having the will and putting the money in the right place to do it. I mean, that's really the bottom line.
Absolutely. And I think that's why people are so concerned that the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, has reversed itself on taking fossil fuel money, for instance. That's just one issue, but it's a significant one if you think about what elected representatives are willing to go to the mat for. And, we already know there's years and years of evidence showing that, politicians are not going to be bold and aggressive on legislation that counters the interests of their major funders. It just doesn't happen. Right. They might give lip service here and there, but they're not going to make it a legislative priority. And, I think the Democratic Party and the leadership, they know what you and I know. They know this stuff, so that makes it all the worse. And it makes it slightly promising, but also all the more maddening to see that, poll after poll after poll shows that the electorate, the population is actually ready for something different. So there are so many polls, and I cite many in my article showing that, folks are ready for, everything from Medicare for all to a Green New Deal to spending money on infrastructure and job creation, things like that. They're all for it. The large majorities are for this. And then we see what happens even under a Democratic Congress. Even if it's better, it's just not nearly enough. And, and I think we've moved into a new stage of urgency and crisis with climate being what it is, and the clock ticking in a very, very real way. Mm-hmm. And we absolutely, for instance, we can't afford the sort of marketized carbon trading systems anymore either, which basically just shift pollution from one zone to another and give these corporations credit to pollute in one place because they did something somewhat green in another area. And this is just absolutely something that we just cannot afford to do. And that we've seen also that the Democratic Party has suffered by not addressing the needs of people around the country, the economic needs of people around the country in urban and rural areas. And that people need good, stable living wage jobs. And so these pieces of legislation are opportunities for them to step up and do that.
Christopher D. Cook, award-winning investigative journalist, author of Diet for a Dead Planet, Big Business, and the Coming Food Crisis, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Christopher, appreciate your time with us. Look forward to having you back again soon. Hopefully the next time we're talking about the 116th Congress, we're talking about some of this stuff actually getting done. Thank you again for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation. Let's hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, an intimate account of Martin Luther King Jr.'s last stand for peace and economic justice. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
It's been pointed out that Donnie Trump has unusually small hands. But who cares? What's truly alarming are his unusually small policy ideas. Draining the swamp, for example. He bragged that he'd be stronger than Drano, promising he'd rid Washington of its infestation with lobbyists, corporate favor seekers, and other swamp critters. But he betrayed that populist pledge from the very start, staffing his entire presidency with CEOs, lobbyists, and Republican megadonors who are gleefully rigging the system for themselves against the rest of us. Also, remember how candidate Trump blistered the behinds of Wall Street's billionaire hedge fund hucksters for getting rich by destroying middle-class jobs? He promised that, by gollies, he would take away their loophole that lets them escape paying taxes they owe. But as president, he wimped out, handing a $1 trillion tax cut to the billionaires, including meekly leaving the pampered hedge funders' loophole entirely untouched. And where's that Make America Great guy who claimed that only he had the vision and chutzpah to rebuild America, pledging to launch a $1 trillion investment in our national infrastructure? His chutzpah petered out and his vision shriveled to a hokey scheme of smoke and mirrors, basically asking states and corporations to come up with the money and calling on them to privatize our public infrastructure. Where's the greatness in that? This is Jim Hightower saying, poor Donnie wants to be thought of as a modern-day Teddy Roosevelt, so he constantly poses as a populist, bigger-than-life bull moose character who's got the right stuff to bust the profiteering trusts in order to stop their rip-offs and their schemes to knock down the middle class. Sadly, though, a pose is all it is, for he's just a run-of-the-mill plutocratic president who speaks loudly but carries nothing bigger than a limp twig when it comes to dealing with the corporate powers.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. This week, Americans once again joined together in the annual commemoration of Martin Luther King Jr. In 1968, King arrived in Memphis, Tennessee, hoping to galvanize a movement for economic equality. One journalist took on the task by writing a vivid account of his final hours. In this encore interview, author Joseph Rosenbloom takes us along on his journey. And we say hello to Joseph Rosenbloom. He's an award-winning investigative reporter who has worked as a journalist for over 4 decades. His new book is titled Redemption, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Last 31 Hours. Joseph Rosenbloom, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you.
This book began as a promise you made to yourself a long time ago. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. In the summer of 1968, I had an internship at the daily a newspaper in Memphis, the Commercial Appeal, and I kept hearing from reporters in the newsroom about the events that had happened a few months before in Memphis that brought Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to the city. And the more I heard, the more intrigued I was by those stories. And I filed away the idea that someday I would like to write about it. It took me quite a while to get around to it, but I eventually did.
How did you go about your reporting?
Well, I started in 2006 interviewing people who had been immersed in the events in Memphis and asking them for their stories. I ended up talking to more than 24 people, many of them in Memphis. And what I heard was compelling stories that I thought hadn't been told before. And the more material I collected, the more I thought there might be a book in it.
Now, one of the themes in the book is that as Dr. King arrives in Memphis on April 3rd, 1968, he was keenly aware of the threat to his own security. How did he talk about that?
Well, it started that morning as he was leaving the Atlanta airport heading to Memphis. There was a bomb threat against his flight targeted specifically at Dr. King. So by the time he arrived in Memphis, that bomb scare, no doubt, was weighing on his mind. By then, he had become a far more controversial figure than he had been even during the civil rights movement in the 50s and first part of the 60s. Because then he was speaking out against the war in Vietnam, and he was planning to stage massive protests in Washington, D.C., in the so-called Poor People's Campaign. And I think he must have sensed that his life was in grave danger by the spring of 1968. And that night, in the so-called mountaintop speech, he spoke about his fear of dying a violent death. He talked openly and emotionally about his dread that he could die at an early age from an assassin's attack.
We're speaking with Joseph Rosenbloom, award-winning investigative reporter. His new book is titled Redemption, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Last 31 Hours. Joseph, King's trip to Memphis was also a moment of great resolve, and he actually had been there just 6 days earlier. Why was he returning?
Well, on the visit 6 days earlier, on March the 28th, he was to lead a march in support of the striking sanitation workers. The march had barely begun before it turned into a riot. A small number of youth started smashing windows downtown, looting stores. But it was Dr. King who was widely condemned for the riot. He was denounced by politicians and editorialists. So he was returning 6 days later to show that he was still in command of his nonviolent movement, to salvage, if you will, redeem his reputation so that he could restore his credibility, that he was still in control of his movement and he could still retain a nonviolent philosophy in his protests.
Dr. King's commitment to the sanitation workers of Memphis was part of his deepening commitment to economic justice as the next stage of the civil rights movement. How did you see that expressed in his final hours?
Well, back in Memphis on April 3rd, he was calling on the African-American community to continue its support of the sanitation workers' strike, urging that they keep clearly in mind that the dispute over wages and working conditions and union recognition, which were at the heart of the strike, ought to be uppermost in everyone's mind. And then the night before he was killed, he spoke passionately at a pro-strike rally to bolster the workers' morale and urging them to stay the course.
This commitment to economic justice was also bringing dissent from within his own ranks and the larger civil rights community. How did that weigh on him?
Well, it weighed heavily on him. He was hearing dissent about his opposition to the Vietnam War. That wasn't popular with a lot of his closest aides, who thought that he should be sticking to civil rights more narrowly defined. And his idea for the Poor People's Campaign was not popular among some of his followers. They thought that it was too vaguely defined, that it wouldn't lead to any results. That again, it was distracting him from the kind of civil rights issues that he had been championing for some time. So there was a lot of dissent, and there were a lot of pressures on him not to oppose the Vietnam War and not to bring this anti-poverty campaign to Washington.
Now, one of the most disturbing things you learned about in researching this book was the failure of the Memphis Police Department to protect Dr. King, even though they knew of the threat to his safety. Give us a detailed sense of how that failure played out.
Well, the story there was no security for Dr. King on his first two visits to Memphis in 1968. The first one was on March 18th, and then he was back, as I said, on March the 28th. The police director in Memphis, Frank Holloman, would later say that the department didn't provide any security for Dr. King on those first two visits because they viewed him simply as just another person involved in the sanitation workers' strike. But there were more threats against Dr. King after the riot on March the 28th. And Holloman did provide a four-man police detail for the first day that he was back. That was April 3rd. But the security for him was discontinued at 5 o'clock that day in the afternoon. So he had no police protection on the next day, April 4th, and that's the day that he was killed. I should add that that it's quite possible that if the police had been protecting Dr. King on April 4th, that they might have been to have prevented him from being murdered. They had protected Dr. King on his visit to Memphis in 1966, and I talked to one of the police officers who was part of that detail, and he said they stuck to King the whole time, and they would escort him everywhere he went. And I think there's a chance that that the events would not have played out as they did, that resulted in Dr. King's death if he had had adequate police protection on April 4th.
Mm-hmm. Well, how have you come to understand the decisions made by the Memphis Police Department?
Well, just that I think he was in greater jeopardy because the police didn't provide any real security for him. Not enough, really, even on the one day, the 7.5 hours that there was a police detail assigned to protect him. So I think the risk was greater, and I think, as I said, I think it might have meant that he was more exposed to an attack and more likely that he would have been killed.
Mm-hmm. Now, by focusing on this sliver of time, how do you hope to deepen our understanding of Dr. King's legacy?
Well, I hope that the story of Memphis and Dr. King imparts to readers of my book the full meaning and resonant emotions of his last hours in Memphis. He was then embarking on his campaign to end poverty in America, and I hope the book spotlights the subject of poverty in a way that has readers looking at it through King's eyes, and I hope it offers them a fuller understanding of how his commitment was deepening at that time to causes that were dear to him, Vietnam and poverty. And I hope it shows the courage that he was bringing to those causes, even though he was facing ever greater risk that he might die from a violent death at any moment.
Mm-hmm. Joseph Rosenbloom, award-winning investigative reporter. The title of the new book, Redemption, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Last 31 Hours. Joseph, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Rebecca Vallis, Vice President for the Poverty to Prosperity program at American Progress.
Joining us in studio from the Center for American Progress and their Poverty to Prosperity program, Vice President Rebecca Vallis. Hi, Rebecca. Nice. Thanks again for coming in.
Hey, Bill. And I feel like when I was sitting down, I was saying someday you'll have me on to talk about good news, but unfortunately not today.
No.
Is there good news out there at all? Anywhere?
Well, I feel like, Peter, you're raising good questions, but I'm getting energized and excited about this new Congress. I will be honest. The 116th Congress has a lot to get excited about. This Democratic presidential primary field is starting to get exciting and deeper by the day. So there's definitely good news to talk about, but that's not why you asked me to come in, is it?
No, but you're right. It would be nice if we could focus on that good news. And I feel good about that, very, very good, like you do, about the 116th Congress. The energy there among these new members, the diversity, it's so exciting. And a lot of people are lamenting the fact that there are so many Democrats out there looking at running in 2020. I think it's fun.
Oh, it's only a good thing.
Before we get rolling here, I'm sorry to change the subject.
Is this the latest tweet?
I have to read his latest tweet.
No. I saw it and then I lost it. I was trying to find it again about he's defending his fast food for the Clemson Tigers.
Yes. We talked about this earlier. Yeah. He served a fast food buffet last night for the Clemson Tigers. It was McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, Domino's, all of that. He tweeted just a moment ago, and he says, "Great being with the national champion Clemson Tigers last night at the White House. Because of the shutdown, I served them massive amounts of fast food.
I paid.
Parentheses, I paid.
Mm-hmm.
Hang on. Over 1,000 hamburgers. HAMBERDERS, etc. Within 1 hour, it was all gone. Great guys and big eaters." He spelled it hamburgers.
Yeah, but hasn't there been some kind of inquiry suggesting that when there are those kinds of misspellings in tweets that it actually is likely that his staff did it intentionally to make it look more likely that he tweeted it himself?
There is a conspiracy theory that, yes, that is the case.
Because I find that so plausible. I really do.
Like, I just tried to type hamburgers in my phone.
You can't do it.
And it wants to change it to hamberzerk. Hambetters, but not hamburgers, and not hamburgers.
You have to override your own phone to make that bad a misspelling.
Yeah, the phone is like, no, what is going on?
You have to really want it.
What is going on? Oh my God!
That whole fast food debacle last night, and again, what's lost in this is they had to do this because of the shutdown.
That's right.
And that's the least damage that we've seen that's being done by the shutdown. It really is hurting American families, but not just federal workers. The ripple effect across the board.
That's exactly right, Bill. And since you're mentioning the shutdown and since, we're talking about some of the silliness with Trump's approach to it, I mean, his callousness is not to be overstated. We've got members of Trump's administration basically making it sound like federal workers who are furloughed and going without paychecks right now are on vacation and they're lucky to be facing this kind of economic instability. We've got Trump telling federal workers, maybe you should just consult your personal attorney to figure out how not to get evicted, how to continue to pay your bills. Maybe you should call your creditors and plead with them to just give you a little bit of extra time. That's not how life works. And if Trump were not so massively, woefully out of touch with the reality facing struggling workers and middle class workers too in this country, he would have a little bit of a better sense of how much tremendous hardship he is causing because of his extended temper tantrum over this racist border wall.
But Nancy Pelosi pointed out the difference with Donald Trump. He doesn't get it because he could always ask his daddy for another check.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And he thinks everybody else is in the same boat
right.
and just hasn't even thought about what it might be like not to have that kind of level of wealth in your family.
Plus, I think there's another factor going on here. For Donald Trump and some of the Republicans in Congress, this is exactly, they love the shutdown because it shuts the government down. I mean, that's been the Tea Party or the Freedom Caucus's goal, number one goal.
It goes all the way back to the desire to shrink government so small that you can drown it in a bathtub. Well, one other way to do it is to shut it down. And, Bill, we're talking about federal workers here, and they rightly have gotten a lot of the attention in terms of who's bearing the brunt of this shutdown. I should note, a lot of federal contractors are actually never going to get the back pay that at least a lot of federal workers who are facing a furlough are going to see when this is all over. So really, really lasting damage that a lot of folks are going to end up facing.
And then you have the ripple effect of, something like I saw an article the other day, the Washington, D.C. Metro. Okay. They're some 50,000 rides short every day now because federal workers aren't coming to work, right? Think about the restaurants, the coffee shops, all not just in Washington, all across the country near these federal buildings that survive because of that population. They're gone.
Huge economic ripple effects. And people are starting to actually pay attention. I've got an op-ed in Rewire today looking at this. People are starting to finally notice the administration's response to this shutdown has been so chaotic and so unprepared that there are actually massive programs like the food stamp program that are literally running out of funds as we speak. So we could watch federal workers not just going without paychecks, but not even able to turn to food assistance if that program potentially ends up seeing massive cuts or even comes to a halt if it runs out of funds sometime in March.
Yeah. I don't know why people are concerned. I mean, the Coast Guard put out a thing saying, well, you could have a bake sale or you could do dog walking or childcare or, you could even maybe become an Uber driver. I mean, they actually put this out to employees that this is how you survive.
It's just astounding. The callousness, the cluelessness, and just how willing Trump literally is to starve this country so that he can play politics over his wall.
Hey, he's not going to starve the country. He's going to feed him McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's and Domino's.
Just the football players, Peter. I think the rest of us are kind of screwed.
The big guys with big appetites.
Rebecca, something that you and I have talked about before that a couple of years ago seemed like it was put down and dismissed as a pipe dream and just promising pie in the sky. Medicare for all. Today, almost everybody is talking about it. Gavin Newsom just elected governor of California. His platform, Medicare for all. And Gavin Newsom is no crazy Bernie lefty. I don't think Bernie's a crazy lefty, by the way. But, I mean, he's not, that far left, right? Pretty centrist politician, left to center for sure. Medicare for all. And so many of the candidates talking about running in 2020, Medicare for all. What's happening and how real is it?
So I think that what we've known for a long time is that the American people understand the importance of making healthcare not just affordable and accessible, but universal. And that's been a groundswell and a longstanding popular position among Americans. That's true across party lines, by the way. It's not just true of progressives, because people understand that everyone should have the right to see a doctor. Everyone should be able to get medical care when they need it. Unfortunately, what we're starting to see really become clearer by the day is that no matter how clear the American people make it that they want to see more health care, not less. Remember the health care fight from just last year and the year before. You had Trump and Republicans in Congress trying to take health care away from tens of millions of Americans, despite what the American people were making very clear they wanted. What I think we're starting to see, unfortunately, and this is what we were teasing before about why you had me on to talk about some bad news, Bill, is that despite how clear the American people have made what they want, whether that's through expanding programs like Medicare, whether that's through expanding programs like Medicaid, which we're continuing to watch every time it's on the ballot, pretty much it succeeds and people vote to expand that very successful program to expand access to health care for their fellow citizens and fellow neighbors in their states. What we're watching is the Trump administration basically deciding, you know what, I'm not done trying to get my horrible, cruel, heartless healthcare cuts through Congress. I'm actually going to try and take matters into my own hands now that I failed legislatively in the healthcare debate from 2017. And we've been watching Trump, as your listeners will know all too well, sabotage the healthcare system at every single turn. And one particular target that has been front and center for this administration is Medicaid. Medicaid, this hugely popular program that now actually serves more people in this country than Medicare. It's about 75 million Americans who receive healthcare through Medicaid. Maybe that's grandma in the nursing home. It's people with disabilities who rely on employment supports and other kinds of services to allow them to live in the community. It's poor workers and low-wage workers. It's kids. It's pretty much, every walk of life in this country represented in the Medicaid program. And what we are watching Trump continue to do is to try to dismantle this popular, successful, effective program basically through every power he can try to figure out in the White House. And a lot of the steps he's actually taking are starting to look like they might be illegal, and I want to get into that with you.
What are they doing?
So, Bill,
Medicaid vastly expanded under the Affordable Care Act.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Medicaid expansion was a big part of the Affordable Care Act, and it was one of the really popular components of that law. But what we've watched going all the way back to Speaker Paul Ryan, and I should say it's fun to say this, former Speaker Paul Ryan, right? Gives me great pleasure to get to say that. His dreams back in college, he let us know, were dismantling Medicaid. That was one of his sort of keg days dreams, right? It came out in news when he was talking about his vision when he was Speaker. He was really questing after trying to dismantle Medicaid, and President Trump jumped on that bandwagon, as did Republicans throughout the healthcare fight. And so while the Affordable Care Act was what got most of the attention in terms of ACA repeal efforts that Republicans were trying to move forward to take healthcare away from tens of millions of Americans, Medicaid was one of the core programs that was actually in the crosshairs during the healthcare fight. But we saw Americans stand up and say, no, I don't want to see healthcare cut. 80% of Americans actually stood up and opposed cuts to Medicaid. But what we've seen Trump do in the year since that fight really ended in earnest, at least for now, is to try to dismantle Medicaid by making it possible for states to take it away from unemployed and underemployed workers. That's his heartless so-called work requirements that we've been watching in the states. And we can talk a little more about how those are playing out now that we're seeing them enforced in places like Arkansas. But what we watched just this past weekend, Bill, was a huge bombshell announcement out of this administration that they are now going to potentially launch yet another massive attack on Medicaid by block granting the program. And that's just code for ending Medicaid's promise to people who qualify for coverage.
Now, this is not my area of expertise, but I believe the difference is with block grants, it's just a block of money that goes to the state that the state can spend any way they want, correct?
That's basically exactly right, Bill.
So instead of sending money that is specified or directed to be used for Medicaid, right, and to keep the program going and to help people who qualify for Medicaid, the state could spend some of that money on Medicaid and spend the rest of it on whatever. Right?
That is potentially one of the risks.
So it's a way of gutting the program.
It is, and it's also, in addition to the sort of slush fund aspect that you note that block grants carry with them as a risk, it's also just a massive backdoor way of cutting the resources that are available for the program. And that's because block grants are basically a way of flat funding a program and then making it shrink over time. So
it's a classic Republican dodge that they've tried to use over and over again. How can they to gut programs when they can't get the actual knife job done by the Congress or whatever? So what do they have to do? I mean, to make it to convert it to block grants, to gut the program that way, do they need an act of Congress or can they do it by executive order?
So that's where things get interesting here. Much like the Trump policy of taking away Medicaid from people who can't find work or get enough hours at their job, that's the policy we saw them unveil this time last year, actually. And red states across the board started to raise their hands and say, yeah, that sounds good to me. I like this heartless idea. Legal advocates have actually been battling those cuts in the courts as we speak. This is yet another act of the Trump administration that legal advocates say is almost certainly unlawful and exceeds the authority that Trump has in the White House. It should require an act of Congress because legal advocates are saying it looks like it violates the.
It's a question then. I mean, in the midterm elections, right? The winning issue for Democrats was health care. But the flip side of that coin is the losing issue for Republicans was health care. Didn't they learn anything?
One would think that maybe they would have learned that the opposite of what the American people want should not be the agenda that they're championing if they plan to keep their jobs. I'm talking about Republicans in Congress. And I think that that's part of why you've actually seen efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act and to dismantle Medicaid not just fail through legislation, but sort of become a little more back burner in terms of what we've seen Republicans in Congress at least continue to champion. But this is where we've really seen Trump refine his playbook in the 2 years that he's been in the White House. And what he's learned is that when he's failed at getting his cruel agenda through Congress, that he doesn't have to give up. He's decided that his plan for programs like Medicaid is to go talk to folks in the administration and say, hey, how else might we cut this program that doesn't require Congress? And, I'm down with breaking the law in the process. That's basically what we've seen him start to do as his playbook on healthcare, and this is just the latest shoe to drop in that story. Right,
and this is a continuation of things that he's tried to do by executive order to undermine and weaken the Affordable Care Act. What is this? What is the health of the Affordable Care Act itself these days? I mean, we know that in terms of new signups or re-ups, right? I mean, they took all the money away from promoting that, advertising that, reminding people that now's the time, you got to renew your policy and whatever. Did everything they could to try to gut it. The Affordable Care Act still exists.
Still the law of the land, despite what Trump would like to see be the
There's
case.
Still people signed up.
And it was the first administration we saw not wanting people to know about open enrollment, as you know, trying to hide that. We're actually going to watch Democrats in Congress now that they have the gavels.
Down.
So what we're seeing is that the Affordable Care Act is strong. The Affordable Care Act remains the law of the land. But Democrats in Congress, as are you, as am I, are really concerned with the administration's deliberate sabotage efforts over the course of the past year. And so now that Democrats actually have the gavels back in the House, we're actually going to watch them investigate the Trump administration's deliberate sabotage efforts to see what's been going on there.
It's a chance for Democrats maybe to restore some of that funding and particularly where Donald Trump has made the cuts. Right?
I think that's right. That's the eventual goal, as well as bringing some accountability and some oversight that's sorely been lacking to bear.
Well, one answer is we could all just go to Canada for our operations.
That's your plan, Bill.
That's what Rand Paul has decided to do, right? He needs a hernia operation. And so having gutted the American healthcare program as much as he can, right? He's going to go to Canada.
Irony doesn't even do it justice. Alanis needs to add a whole next verse to that song after that one. But Bill, I mean, we're joking here, but I can't put too fine a point on the life and death consequences of this administration's healthcare repeal agenda, and Medicaid is front and center in that agenda, as this news from this past week really makes clear. We actually saw, just to remind your listeners, back during the healthcare debate in 2017, we had the Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan entity within Congress that sort of evaluates proposals and puts numbers on things. So they were the ones telling us how many people were going to lose health insurance, for example, every time Republicans came out with a new cruel proposal for stripping it away from millions of Americans. Well, they came out with analysis back during that debate, finding that one version of the bill, the Senate version that was dangerously close to actually making it out of that chamber, it would have literally killed 208,000 people who would not have otherwise died by 2026. They call that excess preventable deaths. Literally, lives are on the line here when people lose the health insurance that allows them to stay healthy and get the medical care that they need. And that is what this administration has made abundantly clear. They're not done trying to see take effect. So really important for folks to be paying attention to this, since it's really getting drowned out during the shutdown.
Yeah, I mean, that's the consequences are that severe. Who was it? Alan Grayson, the former congressman, who said the Republican plan for health care is die, right?
Yeah.
As I recall, and was slammed on the floor of the House for saying that. But
that's
basically.
Yeah, he got a lot of grief for it, but he was absolutely right.
Yeah.
And, Republican architects of these repeal plans, they get really upset when people remind them of this, right? They say, oh, my God, the left is being so histrionic, and, oh, they're screeching again about people dying. Well, sorry, guys, when you take health care away from people, that's what happens. And we're going to talk about it if you're going to continue to champion that as your agenda. On the flip side, Bill, we were talking about Medicaid expansion just a minute ago, a policy that we know isn't just popular. It also works. It expands healthcare to more people who need it. And what we know happens from actually analysis from a colleague of mine at the Center for American Progress is that when you expand Medicaid, the opposite of taking away health insurance, which kills people, you save lives. So actually analysis out of CAP found that if the 14 remaining non-expansion states, the states that still, for ideological reasons for the most part, have not expanded Medicaid to larger populations in their states, we would save over 100,000 lives just in the coming decade. Those are the stakes that Trump is playing politics with as he tries to dismantle Medicaid.
Right. 14 states left, right?
That's right.
Now, have some of those elected Democratic governors that may change?
Some of them have. And so I think we're actually going to watch some interesting...
Virginia, for example, Ralph Northam was able to, I believe.
Virginia did manage to expand Medicaid, and we've seen hundreds of thousands of Virginians now receive health insurance as of this year who previously had not. Unfortunately, that Virginia Medicaid expansion actually came with a sort of a poison pill that is weakening the expansion. That was that they slipped in a Republican compromise, which was to make Medicaid only available to people who could log a certain number of hours of work per week. So again, those work reporting requirements, I'm putting that in quotes, that Trump wanted to see become the law of the land in states. So a little bit of good, a little bit of bad, but we are definitely seeing states that previously had not considered expansion start to actually move forward those talks.
We've talked mainly about health care, and we don't have much time left, but I'm intrigued by the title of your program, Poverty to Prosperity, because poverty is just something that nobody talks about anymore. I mean, poverty is a very serious problem in this country, particularly among kids, correct?
You are exactly right, and I hate every time I'm able to say this sentence because I look forward to the day that it's no longer true, but children are our nation's poorest citizens in this country.
And how many Americans living in poverty?
So the share of Americans, and I'm going to answer this question a little bit differently than most people do. Rather than looking point in time at how many people are officially poor using government statistics that frankly don't even capture what it costs to live in this country, Bill, 43% of American households right now don't earn enough to afford food and housing and health care. And that is the kind of measure that we should be using as we think about people struggling to make ends meet in this country.
43% of the population of the wealthiest country on the planet cannot afford
food and housing and health care, basics that we all need to survive, Bill.
Boy, that's pretty chilling.
So it's not a them, it's an us, and it's something that I have to say I'm really excited, start leaving off where we started this conversation, to see presidential candidates throwing their hats in the ring, actually running on making sure that we have affordable housing for each and every family in this country, that we have expanded, say, low-income tax credits like we're seeing from Sherrod Brown to ensure that child poverty is not something that the United States continues to live with as an albatross around its neck. Really exciting momentum among folks who are starting to realize this is an issue we should all be talking about.
And that gets us back to the hopeful note that we started our conversation on, right? About at least this time we have a democratically controlled House that can raise some of these issues and move some legislation, and maybe even prod the Senate to go along. Great work that you're doing, Rebecca. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Bill. At
the Center for American Progress, it's AmericanProgress.org, right? Where they can catch up with you on a daily basis. Because you can't come in every day, but we love having you in.
I'd do it if you asked.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Christopher Cook, Joseph Rosenbloom, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.